Have you ever woken up drenched in sweat, your heart pounding as if it's about to burst out of your chest? You try to calm yourself, telling yourself it was just a dream, just a figment of your imagination. But deep down, you know that what you experienced was something far more sinister. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey through the darkest recesses of the mind, a place where dreams and reality blur, and the things that lurk in the shadows are all too real.
In the distance, I could just make out the outline of a decrepit mansion, its windows like black, soulless eyes staring back at me. As I moved closer, the feeling of dread grew stronger. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it voices. Soft, unintelligible, but undeniably present. They seemed to be calling me, urging me to enter that cursed place. My feet moved on their own, as if drawn by some unseen force, and before I knew it, I was standing before the rotting wooden door of the mansion. It creaked open, with a sound that echoed through the hollow corridors, sending a chill down my spine. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the entire house. I was plunged into darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I could see the faint glow of candlelight flickering at the end of the hallway. The air was cold, much colder than it had been outside, and each breath I took felt like it was filling my lungs with ice. The floor beneath me creaked with every step, as if the house itself was alive, groaning under the weight of its own history. There was something deeply wrong about this place. The walls seemed to pulse with the life of their own, and the shadows were not just the absence of light. They moved, they twisted, they writhed as if trying to break free from the corners where they were trapped. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, watching, waiting. And then I heard it. A sound so faint, I almost missed it. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house. A low, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of some monstrous creature. With every beat, the walls seemed to close in on me, and the air grew thicker, more oppressive. I knew I should turn back. I knew I should run. But something in that house had a hold on me. I was a moth drawn to the flame, and I couldn't escape the pull. But before we go any further, I need you to do something. If you're brave enough to continue this journey with me, if you're ready to face whatever horrors lie ahead, then subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Trust me, you're going to want to stay tuned, because what happens next is something that will haunt you long after the video ends. This is not just a story. It's an invitation to explore the darkest corners of your mind, where nightmares are born and where they come to life. The night had an eerie stillness to it, a quiet that felt too heavy, too unnatural. As I drifted into sleep, the transition from the conscious world to the dream was seamless. So seamless that I didn't even realize it had happened. One moment, I was lying in my bed, and the next, I found myself standing in front of an ancient mansion, shrouded in fog, deep within a forest that seemed to have no end. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own, crawling across the ground like dark, spectral fingers reaching out to pull me into the abyss. The mansion before me was a towering, decaying structure, its once grand facade now crumbling and overtaken by the relentless grip of time. Vines snaked their way up the cracked stone walls, and the windows, those dark, hollow windows, seemed to stare back at me, as if the house itself was alive, waiting, watching. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a cloying odor that clung to the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped my chest, I felt an inexplicable pull toward the mansion, as if some unseen force was guiding my steps. As I approached, the heavy wooden doors creaked open with a groan that echoed through the stillness of the night, inviting me in. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating through my body like the tolling of a death knell. I hesitated at the threshold, but the pull was too strong. I had to go inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, sealing me inside. The interior of the mansion was cloaked in darkness, with only the faintest glimmers of moonlight filtering through the dirty, cracked windows. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I took tentative steps forward, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The air was colder here, almost frigid, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me as I exhaled. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I was paralyzed by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The walls were lined with portraits, their frames thick with dust, the faces within barely discernible, but there was something wrong with those faces. Each one seemed distorted, twisted in agony, their eyes following me as I moved deeper into the house. As I wandered through the dimly lit corridors, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over me. I had never been here before, and yet every detail felt disturbingly familiar. The layout of the rooms, the pattern of the wallpaper peeling from the damp walls, even the creaky, uneven steps of the grand staircase that wound its way up to the second floor. It was as if I had walked these halls in another life, in another time, but the familiarity only made the fear more potent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The shadows seemed to thicken around me, growing darker, more oppressive, and the air felt heavy with a malevolent presence. I could hear faint whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere deep within the mansion, their words indistinguishable but filled with a sense of urgency and malice. Suddenly, I was drawn to a specific room at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, a pale, flickering light emanating from within. My hand shook as I reached out to push the door open, the wood cold and rough beneath my fingers. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room bathed in a sickly yellow glow. At the center of the room stood a grand mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked, reflecting the faint light in eerie, fractured patterns. But it wasn't the mirror that held my attention. It was the figure standing in front of it, a tall, shadowy figure, its back turned to me, shrouded in darkness. The figure was completely still, yet I could feel an intense energy radiating from it, a palpable aura of malevolence that sent chills down my spine. It was as if the very air around it was charged with something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for this moment. The figure began to whisper, its voice low and guttural, the words foreign and unintelligible, but filled with a cold, bone-chilling menace. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the fear was overwhelming, clouding my thoughts. And then, without warning, the figure began to turn slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. My breath caught in my throat as I waited to see the face of this nightmare. But as it turned, I realized there was no face, only darkness, a void where features should have been, an abyss that seemed to pull at the very edges of my sanity. A scream built in my chest, but no sound came out. My legs felt like they were made of lead, refusing to obey the frantic commands my brain was sending. I was trapped, paralyzed by terror, as the faceless figure continued to turn, its empty gaze locking onto mine. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers louder, filling my ears with a cacophony of voices that I couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went black. I was yanked out of the dream with a jolt, sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But the fear didn't dissipate with the dream. As I glanced at the clock, the numbers 3:33 glowed ominously in the darkness, and the whispers from the dream continued to echo in my ears. Was it really just a dream? Or had I glimpsed something far more sinister? Something that was only just beginning? The oppressive silence of the mansion clung to me like a shroud as I stood frozen, trying to comprehend what I had just seen. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one a desperate attempt to dispel the cold that had seeped into my bones. The faceless figure was gone, vanished into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared, but its presence lingered, an unseen force that twisted the air around me. I forced myself to move, each step a monumental effort, as if the house itself was resisting my every motion. The hallways seemed longer now, the shadows deeper, and the faint whispers that I had heard before were growing louder, more distinct. They weren't just murmurs anymore. They were voices, urgent and filled with a malicious intent that set my nerves on edge. They seemed to be coming from the very walls, the floor, even the ceiling above me, surrounding me in a chorus of dread. As I stumbled through the labyrinth of darkened corridors, the mansion seemed to shift around me. The layout I had thought I recognized was changing, the walls closing in, the doorways leading to places they shouldn't. It was as if the house was alive, bending reality to its will, trapping me in a nightmarish maze with no escape. Every corner I turned brought me face to face with a new horror. Portraits that had once been innocuous were now twisted into grotesque visages, their eyes following me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned and creaked, some splintering as if something massive was moving beneath them, something that wanted to break free. And then there were the mirrors. They were everywhere, lining the walls, hanging at odd angles, each one reflecting not just my terrified face, but something else, something lurking just out of sight. In one, I caught a glimpse of a shadow darting behind me, only to turn around and find nothing but empty air. In another, my reflection began to distort, the features warping into a grotesque mockery of my own face, the eyes hollow and dark. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to look deeper, to see what lay beyond the glass. Desperation clawed at my mind, and I began to run, the panic overtaking any semblance of rational thought. The walls seemed to stretch as I moved, the doors shifting away from me, taunting me with their distance. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence, each one a reminder of how alone I was in this place. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me, stalking me through the twisting corridors, its presence growing ever closer with each passing second. Finally, I reached a staircase that spiraled down into the bowels of the mansion. The darkness below was impenetrable, a void that seemed to swallow the light whole. But I had no choice. Whatever was behind me was closing in, and there was nowhere else to go. I descended the stairs, each step echoing like a death knell, the air growing colder, thicker, with each downward spiral. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more distinct, until I could almost make out the words, warnings, pleas, threats, all melding into a cacophony of madness. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a long, narrow hallway, the walls lined with more of those cursed mirrors. But these were different. Each one seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, the glass rippling like water. As I passed them, my reflection didn't follow my movements. Instead, it stayed fixed, staring back at me with a malevolent grin that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried not to look, but the mirrors pulled at my gaze, their twisted images drawing me in. And then I saw it, at the far end of the hallway, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was the faceless figure. It was watching me. I could feel its gaze, even without eyes. The whispers crescendoed, their urgency palpable, as if they were warning me to turn back, to escape while I still could. But I was trapped with no way out, and the figure began to move toward me, its steps slow, deliberate, each one sending a jolt of terror through my body. I backed away, but the mirrors on either side seemed to close in, the walls narrowing as the figure approached. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, the air thick and suffocating. The figure was getting closer, its presence overwhelming, and the whispers had become a deafening roar, filling my head with 1,000 voices, all screaming in unison. With nowhere left to go, I turned to one of the mirrors, hoping against hope that there might be some way out, some escape from the nightmare closing in around me. But what I saw in the reflection wasn't just my terrified face. It was the figure, standing right behind me, its faceless head tilting as if it were observing its prey. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and in that moment, I knew there was no escape, no waking up from this nightmare. The figure reached out, its hand, a dark, shadowy blur, moving toward me with an agonizing slowness. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, drowning out the whispers, the creaks, even the sound of my own ragged breathing. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to even scream as the darkness closed in around me. The figure's hand now inches away from my shoulder. And then, just as its fingers brushed my skin, everything went black. The silence was absolute, suffocating as if the very world had been swallowed by the void. When I came to, I was lying on the cold, hard floor, the faceless figure nowhere to be seen. But the fear, the dread, the overwhelming sense of doom that remained gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I knew, in the deepest part of my soul, that this was far from over. The figure was still out there, waiting, watching, and it wouldn't rest until it had claimed me. The darkness was suffocating, a void so complete that it seemed to swallow all sound, all light, all hope. I lay there on the cold, unforgiving floor, every muscle in my body frozen with terror. The faceless figure had vanished, leaving behind only the echoes of my own ragged breaths and the relentless pounding of my heart. But the fear lingered, a gnawing dread that burrowed deep into my mind, whispering that this nightmare was far from over. Slowly, I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. The hallway stretched out endlessly in both directions, the mirrors lining the walls now dark and lifeless, their glass surfaces reflecting nothing but shadows. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides, broken only by the faintest of sounds, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. It was a sound that resonated in my chest, each beat a reminder that something terrible was drawing nearer. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape, but with every step I took, the house seemed to shift and warp around me. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowered, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to undulate like the surface of a dark, treacherous ocean. The hallway twisted and turned in impossible ways, defying all logic, as if the mansion itself was alive, a malevolent entity intent on trapping me within its nightmarish labyrinth. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, and with it came the return of the whispers, those disembodied voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They were louder now, clearer, and though I still couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. Anger, fear, and a deep, ancient hatred that chilled me to the core. It was as if the very walls were alive with the voices of the damned, all crying out in torment, all begging for release. I turned a corner, and there it was again, the door I had seen in the dream. It stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, with a faint, flickering light spilling out from within. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that this was the same door I had seen before, the one that had led me to the faceless figure. But there was no turning back now. The door seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, drawing me in, and despite every instinct screaming at me to flee, I knew I had to see what lay beyond. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open, the wood creaking ominously as it swung inward. The room beyond was small, dimly lit by a single, guttering candle that cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood a figure, a tall, imposing figure shrouded in darkness, its back once again turned to me. It was the faceless figure, and it was waiting. My breath caught in my throat, and I fought the urge to run. There was no escape, no waking up from this nightmare. The figure stood perfectly still, but I could feel its gaze, cold, empty, and utterly devoid of humanity, boring into me, even without eyes. It was as if the darkness itself was watching me, judging me, and I knew in that moment that whatever this thing was, it was far more than just a dream. The figure began to move, turning slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. My heart pounded in my chest, my mouth dry, my body paralyzed with fear. The faceless head swiveled to face me, and though it had no features, no eyes, no mouth, I could feel its gaze piercing through me, reaching deep into my soul. It was an emptiness so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to drain the very life from the room, leaving only a hollow shell where once there had been warmth and light. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat constricted, my voice silenced by the sheer weight of the terror that gripped me. The figure took a step toward me, and the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, their words merging into a single, overwhelming roar that drowned out everything else. As the figure drew closer, I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, a touch so icy, so devoid of warmth, that it sent a jolt of pure, primal terror through my entire being. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me as the figure reached out, its fingers, dark, shadowy tendrils, curling around my arm. The touch was like a vice, crushing, suffocating, pulling me into the darkness. And then, in that moment of absolute terror, I did the only thing I could think of. I closed my eyes, praying that when I opened them again, I would be safe in my bed, that this nightmare would be over. But the darkness was all-encompassing, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket, and I felt myself sinking deeper, deeper into the void. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I was no longer in the mansion. I was back in my bedroom, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my body trembling. The clock on the nightstand read 3:33 a.m., the same time as before, and the whispers. The whispers were still there, faint but unmistakable, echoing in the corners of the room. I was awake, but the nightmare hadn't ended. The terror hadn't ended. The figure was gone, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. This wasn't just a dream, it was something far more sinister, something that had followed me out of the darkness and into the waking world. I could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of consciousness, waiting for the next time I closed my eyes. And as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I realized with a sinking dread that there was no escaping it. The nightmare had only just begun. The morning light that streamed through my window did little to dispel the lingering darkness that had settled over me. I had managed to escape the nightmare, but the fear had followed me into the waking world, clinging to me like a shadow that refused to be shaken. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside sent my heart racing, my mind replaying the events of the night before. I tried to convince myself that it had just been a dream, a figment of my imagination twisted by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something about that dream, something too vivid, too real to be dismissed so easily. The faceless figure, the whispers, the suffocating darkness. It all felt as though it had imprinted itself on my soul, leaving a stain that no amount of daylight could erase. And then there was the time. 3:33 a.m. The exact moment when I had woken up in terror, my room still echoing with the sounds of the nightmare. It was too specific, too coincidental to be a mere figment of sleep. As the hours passed, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. The memory of the dream haunted me, its details sharper, more defined than any other dream I had ever had. And then, almost as if guided by some unseen force, I began to search for answers. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to understand what had happened to me, to uncover the truth behind the faceless figure that had invaded my sleep. I began my research with a vague sense of unease, the fear that had gripped me in the dream still lurking in the back of my mind. I started with general searches, dreams, nightmares, sleep paralysis, hoping to find some rational explanation. But nothing I found matched the intensity, the sheer terror of what I had experienced. There was something more to this, something that went beyond the realm of simple nightmares. Then I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to paranormal experiences, a dark corner of the internet where people shared their encounters with the unknown. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I wanted to delve deeper into this world of fear and superstition. But the pull was too strong, the need to understand, too great to resist. As I read through the stories, a chilling realization began to dawn on me. There were others, people from all walks of life, from all corners of the globe, who had experienced something eerily similar to what I had. They spoke of dreams that felt more like memories, of encounters with a faceless figure that seemed to know them, to watch them, even when they were there. The details varied. Some saw the figure in a different setting, some heard different whispers, but the core of the experience was always the same, a suffocating terror, a sense of being trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. One story in particular caught my attention. It was from a woman who had dreamed of a decrepit mansion deep within a forest, a mansion eerily similar to the one I had seen in my dream. She described the same twisted hallways, the same oppressive darkness, and the same faceless figure that had haunted her every step. But what chilled me to the bone was what she wrote next. The mansion wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real. My hands trembled as I read her account, my breath catching in my throat. The woman had done what I was now contemplating. She had searched for the mansion, desperate to prove to herself that it was just a dream, but she had found it. It was an old, abandoned estate on the outskirts of a small town, a place with a dark history of disappearances and tragedies. The locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. My blood ran cold as I realized that the mansion she described was the exact same one from my dream. I couldn't believe it. How could a place I had never seen before, never even heard of, appear so vividly in my nightmare? And yet, the more I read, the more convinced I became that this was no coincidence. There was a connection, a link between me and that place, one that I couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, my obsession with the mansion grew. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that I had to go there, that I had to see it for myself. The fear that had gripped me during the dream was still there, lurking in the shadows. But now, it was mixed with something else. Curiosity, a desperate need for answers. I spent hours scouring the internet for any information I could find about the mansion. It was a place shrouded in mystery, its history buried beneath layers of rumors and half-forgotten tales. What I found only fueled my obsession further. The mansion had been the site of a series of gruesome murders in the late 1800s, the details of which were still shrouded in mystery. The victims had all been found with their faces mutilated, their identities erased, as if someone or something had wanted to remove any trace of who they had been. And then there were the disappearances. Over the years, people who had gone to investigate the mansion, drawn by the same curiosity that now consumed me, had vanished without a trace. Their bodies were never found, and the few who returned spoke of terrifying encounters, of being stalked by a faceless figure that seemed to know their every move. The more I read, the more I knew I had to go there. I had to see it with my own eyes, had to confront whatever it was that had invaded my dreams. But, as the day of my planned visit drew closer, the fear returned with a vengeance. The whispers that had faded during the day began to creep back, filling my nights with a sense of impending doom. I knew that I was stepping into something far beyond my understanding, something that could very well consume me. But I couldn't stop. The mansion was calling to me, and I had to answer. Whether it was madness or something darker, I didn't know. All I knew was that I had to go, had to face whatever was waiting for me in that dark, twisted place. The line between dream and reality had blurred, and I was about to step into the unknown, driven by a need for answers that outweighed even my own fear of what I might find. The day arrived with an eerie stillness that hung in the air like a shroud. heavy and oppressive. The sun was hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, casting the world in a muted, colorless light that seemed to drain the life out of everything it touched. As I prepared to leave, a sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach, a cold, gnawing fear that only grew stronger with each passing moment. But there was no turning back now. I was driven by a force stronger than my fear, an insatiable need to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The drive to the mansion was long and winding, the road cutting through dense forests that seemed to close in around me as I drew closer to my destination. The trees were tall and ancient, their gnarled branches intertwining above me like the fingers of some monstrous entity, blotting out what little light remained. The further I drove, the more isolated I became, the world outside my car growing darker, more foreboding. It was as if I was being swallowed by the very landscape, pulled into a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Finally, I arrived at the edge of the forest, where the road ended abruptly, giving way to a narrow, overgrown path that led deeper into the woods. The mansion was hidden somewhere within, shrouded in shadows, waiting. My hands trembled as I cut the engine and stepped out of the car, the silence of the forest pressing in on me from all sides. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and every breath I took felt like it was filling my lungs with something ancient and malevolent. With each step I took down the path, the fear that had been gnawing at me grew stronger, more insistent. The trees seemed to watch me as I passed, their twisted forms bending toward me as if to whisper secrets I wasn't meant to hear. The path was narrow and uneven, the ground beneath my feet soft and treacherous, as though the earth itself was trying to drag me down. But I pushed forward, driven by the same force that had haunted me since the night of the dream. After what felt like an eternity, the mansion came into view, looming out of the darkness like a forgotten relic of a time long past. It was even more decrepit than I had imagined, its once grand facade now crumbling and covered in a thick layer of moss and ivy. The windows were shattered, their dark, empty frames staring back at me like the hollow eyes of a corpse. The roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the entire structure seemed to lean to one side, as if it were on the verge of collapsing in on itself. But despite its state of decay, the mansion exuded a palpable sense of malevolence, a dark energy that seemed to pulse from within its walls. The air around it was colder, the shadows deeper, and the silence was so complete, so absolute, that it felt as though the entire world had fallen away, leaving only this place, this moment. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence, but I forced myself to move forward, up the steps that creaked and groaned under my weight. The front door was ajar, just as it had been in my dream, and as I pushed it open, the same sense of dread washed over me, even stronger now that I was standing on the threshold of the place that had haunted my nightmares. The interior of the mansion was dark and silent, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, each step sending a jolt of fear through my body, but I couldn't stop. I had to see it through. As I ventured deeper into the mansion, the sense of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. The shadows seemed to move just at the edge of my vision, flickering and shifting like dark, twisted figures that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step I took. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls, seeping up from the floor, even drifting down from the ceiling. They were voices filled with anguish, anger, and something else, something ancient and evil that I couldn't quite grasp. I reached the grand staircase that spiraled up into the darkness, its steps warped and broken, the banister covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. My breath caught in my throat as I remembered this staircase from the dream, every detail exactly as I had seen it before. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and they seemed to be urging me upward, drawing me toward something that lay hidden in the shadows above. With trembling hands, I gripped the banister and began to climb, each step a monumental effort, as if the weight of the entire house was pressing down on me. The air grew colder, the darkness more complete, until I could barely see my hand in front of my face. But I kept going, driven by a force I didn't understand, a compulsion that overrode all my instincts of self-preservation. At the top of the stairs, I found myself in a long, narrow hallway, its walls lined with more of those cursed mirrors. They reflected not just my pale, terrified face, but something else. Dark, shadowy figures that moved just out of sync with my own reflection. As if there was something behind the glass. Something that was watching me, mimicking my every move. My skin crawled as I realized that these weren't just ordinary mirrors. They were portals, windows into another world. A world where the faceless figure waited. And then I saw it, at the far end of the hallway, standing just outside the reach of the faint light that filtered through the broken windows. The faceless figure. It was exactly as I had seen it in my dream, tall and imposing, its dark form shrouded in shadows, its featureless head tilted slightly, as if it were listening to the whispers that now filled the hallway. My heart raced, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, as I realized that there was no turning back. I was trapped, caught in the web of my own nightmare, and the figure was waiting for me to make the next move. I forced myself to move forward, each step agonizingly slow, the fear gripping my chest like a vice. The figure didn't move, didn't react as I approached, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and empty, like the void itself. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices all screaming in unison, filling my head with their madness, their despair. I knew that whatever happened next, there would be no going back, no waking up from this nightmare. This was real, more real than anything I had ever known. As I reached the end of the hallway, the figure finally began to move. It didn't walk, didn't step forward, but seemed to glide toward me, its form shifting and distorting as it closed the distance. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, until I could barely breathe, barely think. The figure loomed over me, its faceless head inches from my own, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. And then, with a sudden, violent jolt, the figure reached out, its hand, a dark, twisted mass of shadows, grasping my arm with a strength that defied belief. Pain shot through my body, a searing, burning agony that made me scream. But no sound came out. The whispers drowned out everything, filling my mind with their madness, their darkness, until there was nothing left but the figure and the void. In that moment, I knew that I was lost. The mansion had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others before me. The line between dream and reality had blurred, and now I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The figure's grip tightened, pulling me deeper into the darkness, into the void where the whispers awaited, and I realized with a sinking dread that this was the end. There would be no waking up, no return to the light. The nightmare was real, and it had finally consumed me. The darkness around me was absolute, a suffocating void that seemed to crush the very air from my lungs. The faceless figure's grip was like ice, its shadowy hand wrapped around my arm with a strength that defied reality. I could feel the coldness seeping into my bones, spreading through my body like a poison, sapping my strength, my will to fight. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices that battered against my mind, each one more insistent, more malevolent than the last. They were telling me to give in, to surrender to the darkness, to let it consume me. And for a moment, I wanted to anything to escape the pain, the terror that gripped me. But then, somewhere deep within me, a spark of defiance flared. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With a surge of desperate energy, I pulled away from the figure, tearing myself free from its icy grasp. Pain shot through my arm where it had held me, a searing agony that almost brought me to my knees. But I forced myself to move, to stumble backward, away from the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. The figure loomed before me, taller and more menacing than ever. Its faceless head tilted slightly, as if it were considering my defiance with cold, detached curiosity. The shadows around it seemed to writhe and twist, reaching out like tendrils, trying to pull me back into the void. But I didn't stop, didn't let the fear paralyze me. I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing hollowly in the darkness, the whispers now a distant roar that I tried to block out. I fled down the narrow hallway, the walls seeming to close in on me, the shadows deepening with every step I took. The mirrors on either side of me reflected not just my own terrified face, but the figure as well. Always there, always just behind me. Its dark form distorted and twisted in the glass. It was as if the mansion itself was alive, its walls and floors shifting and warping to trap me, to keep me from escaping. Finally, I burst through a door at the end of the hallway and found myself in a large, circular room, its walls lined with more of those cursed mirrors. But these mirrors were different, larger, older, their surfaces cracked and stained with age. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the reflections within them shifting and moving as if they had a life of their own. I could see myself in each one, but my reflections were wrong, twisted, distorted versions of me, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes dark and empty. And behind each one stood the faceless figure, its presence more ominous than ever. I was trapped. The room had no other exits, no windows, no way out. The only light came from the flickering flames of a dozen candles scattered around the room, their weak glow barely enough to pierce the darkness. The figure stood in the doorway, blocking my only escape, its faceless head tilted in that same unnerving way, as if it were amused by my desperation. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, filling my head with a madness that threatened to overwhelm me. In the center of the room stood a single ornate mirror, larger and more elaborate than the others. Its frame was carved with strange, arcane symbols, and its surface was so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. As I approached, I realized with a sinking dread that the mirror wasn't reflecting the room, or me, or even the figure. Instead, it showed something far more terrifying, a vast, endless void, filled with swirling shadows and countless indistinct forms moving within it. It was the same void that I had felt pulling at me in the hallway, the same darkness that had threatened to consume me. And then I understood. The mirror was a portal, a gateway to the nightmare realm that had invaded my dreams, that had followed me into the waking world. The figure wasn't just a manifestation of my fear, it was a guardian, a keeper of this dark place. And it had been leading me here all along, guiding me toward this final moment, this final choice. The figure stepped forward, its shadowy form reflected in the mirrors that lined the room, multiplying until it surrounded me on all sides. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, a chorus of voices all urging me to step through the mirror, to surrender to the darkness, to let it claim me once and for all. I could feel the pull of the void, a cold, relentless force that tugged at the edges of my mind, promising release, promising an end to the fear, the pain. But something inside me resisted, a small, stubborn spark of light that refused to be extinguished. I didn't want to give in, didn't want to let the darkness win. I had come this far, faced my deepest fears, and I wasn't ready to let them consume me. With a surge of defiance, I turned away from the mirror, my eyes locking onto the figure's faceless head. "I won't do it," I whispered, my voice shaking but determined. "I won't give in." For a moment, everything was still. The whispers fell silent. The shadows stopped their writhing, and the figure stood motionless, as if it were considering my words. Then, slowly, it began to retreat, the darkness around it receding, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. The figure's head tilted one last time as if acknowledging my defiance, and then it vanished, dissolving into the shadows, leaving me alone in the room. The silence that followed was absolute. The darkness less oppressive but still present, still lingering at the edges of the room. I knew that I wasn't free, that the nightmare wasn't truly over, but I had won a small victory. I had resisted, had refused to let the darkness consume me, and for now, that was enough. But as I turned to leave, my eyes caught one last glimpse of the mirror at the center of the room. The void was still there, still swirling with shadows, still waiting. And deep within it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My own reflection, staring back at me with dark, empty eyes, a twisted smile on its face. I fled the room, my heart pounding, the whispers echoing faintly in my ears. I didn't stop until I was out of the mansion, out of the forest, and back in the safety of my own home. But even then, the fear didn't leave me. The darkness was still there, lurking at the edges of my vision, the memory of the void and the faceless figure haunting my every thought. I had escaped, but I knew that it was only a matter of time before the nightmare returned. The figure was waiting, the darkness was waiting, and the next time I might not be strong enough to resist. The final confrontation was over, but the true horror was just beginning. The night was far from over. It was only just beginning. The days that followed my escape from the mansion were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I had returned to the comfort of my own home, but the terror I had faced lingered like a shadow that clung to every corner of my life. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a light bulb sent a jolt of fear through me, a reminder that the darkness was never far away. I had thought that leaving the mansion behind would bring me peace, but instead it only deepened the dread that had taken root in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a constant, oppressive sensation that gnawed at the edges of my sanity, a weight that pressed down on me no matter where I was or what I was doing. The figure, the faceless entity that had haunted my dreams and chased me through the mansion, was still out there. I could feel its presence lurking just beyond the veil of reality, waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. Sleep offered no respite. Each night I was plagued by nightmares that were even more vivid, more terrifying than before. The mansion reappeared, twisted and decayed, its hallways darker and more labyrinthine than ever. The faceless figure was always there, a silent sentinel watching my every move, its presence more menacing with each passing dream. The whispers returned too, louder now, their words almost discernible, yet still just out of reach, like a forgotten memory that refused to surface. But the worst part was the feeling of inevitability. No matter how far I ran, no matter how desperately I tried to cling to the waking world, I knew that the nightmare would always find me. It was as if a part of me had been left behind in that mansion, a part that was now forever tethered to the darkness that dwelled there. And with each night, I felt myself being drawn back, the pull of the void growing stronger, more insistent. I tried to fight it, tried to resist the lure of sleep, but exhaustion eventually took its toll. The days began to blur together, a haze of half-remembered dreams and fleeting moments of clarity. I became withdrawn, isolated, afraid to close my eyes, afraid to sleep, because I knew that the next time I did, I might not wake up. The darkness was always there, just waiting for the chance to pull me under for good. And then one night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it. The soft, almost imperceptible sound of whispers. They weren't coming from within my mind this time. They were real, echoing through the room, surrounding me. My heart pounded in my chest and a cold sweat broke out on my skin as I realized that the nightmare had crossed the threshold between dream and reality. The faceless figure had found a way in. I bolted upright, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any hint of the shadows that had haunted me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with their sinister, unintelligible murmurings. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just the remnants of a bad dream. But deep down, I knew the truth. The darkness had followed me, and there was no escaping it now. I stumbled out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me as I reached for the light switch. But when I flicked it on, nothing happened. The room remained cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the pale moonlight that filtered through the window, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a vortex, and in the corner of my eye, I saw it, a dark figure, just at the edge of the light, standing perfectly still, watching me. It was the faceless figure exactly as it had appeared in the mansion, tall and shrouded in shadows, its head tilted in that unnerving way as if it were contemplating my fear. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, to flee. But I was paralyzed, trapped by the weight of the terror that gripped me. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, piercing through me, reaching into the very depths of my soul. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to dissolve, its form dissipating into the shadows, leaving me alone in the room once more. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart in my ears. But I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The figure had left, but it would return. The darkness would return. I sank to the floor, my mind racing, my body trembling with the aftershocks of fear. There was no escaping it, no way to banish the darkness that had taken root in my life. The faceless figure was a part of me now, a constant presence that would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was only a matter of time before it came back, before it claimed me for good. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in the darkness, but eventually I managed to pull myself together. I knew I had to do something, anything, to keep the terror at bay. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and began to record my story, desperate to share what had happened, to warn others of the danger that lurked in the shadows. But even as I spoke, I could feel the darkness closing in, the whispers creeping back into the edges of my mind. As I finished, I looked into the camera, my voice barely more than a whisper. If you're watching this, if you've felt what I've felt, if you've seen what I've seen, be careful. The darkness is out there, and it's waiting for you. Don't let it in.